Okay, well, I'm going to start with a preface. And I'm saying this for the benefit of folks who may not understand what I'm doing. Now, when I came to this ministry, I am extremely grateful that I had the mindset that I had. And I'm just going to be blunt and tell you what it was. Like most of you, I was gripped by the teaching. But there were a few issues I had to get over. You know, it all depends on where you come from, what your background is, what you've been exposed to. So I completely acknowledge my ignorance on certain subjects when I started attending the church and started listening. And one of those was a little bit confusing to me. You know, you've heard me reference that people back probably in the late 70s, pushing into the 80s. Seems a lot of people were drawn by secondary and tertiary subjects that were taught here. Okay? And if you know what I'm talking about, great. And if you don't, I'll just say it real quick. There were subjects that the late Dr. Scott taught on or talked about. For example, pyramid teaching was one of them. And unless you could follow the concept and the reasoning and the logic and really have some exposure to something, it wouldn't make sense. So I don't get it. What's the pyramid have to do with the gospel, right? And some of these other subjects that you could make a case for, but the reality is as we mature, we start maybe asking different and better questions. And that happened to me because I thought, well, these secondary and tertiary stuff, they're all great, but don't get hooked on that. Because it's this book that you need to be hooked on. If you're going to hang your hat on other things and you want to, then don't be in the church. Now, my mindset was that some of these subjects were so out there that unless a person could really follow the logic and reasoning, you'd probably be labeled a little nutty for following certain teachings. That's how the outside world viewed a lot of what came out of Faith Center. And I know what I'm saying, some of you are reluctantly, but you acknowledge it is true. So I have now a new dilemma, which is I'm diving into another series of messages, and I want to make sure at the get-go that if you are relatively young in the faith, that you don't make the mistake that I made, which is immediately assuming that you absolutely unequivocally know there could be no crystal clear connection back to the Bible, that somehow secondary and tertiary subjects, if they are seemingly out there, they could never correlate to the gospel. That is an error. And the reason why that's an error is because when we start looking and digging, as we're kind of into a new series, trying to piece together evidences for the life of Christ, and obviously I'm looking at birth, then we'll call them the lost years. I'm not going to teach on that. There's a lot of speculation. But then the ministry of Christ, and ultimately his death, crucifixion, and resurrection, which usually I'm thinking that this would be a logical place to culminate. But as I said before in a few of these messages, part of the problem is that when I get to wanting to preach on the resurrection and questions of Christ's existence come up, how do you know? How can you prove it? That's too much for me to try and answer within a resurrection message, because this subject that I'm touching right now is so vast and there are so many different places to pull from that when I'm done, we might actually be around Easter if I keep going on this, because there's just that much information to put out there, and it's not all looking in the same direction. So I say this to those who are relatively new to the faith. Please do not say, oh, Pastor Scott has dabbled off into some crazy stuff in the stars and that's all out there stuff, because when you start looking, you will see that there are no accidents here, and in fact, probably a testament to something that God did as I preach this message today that I think will bring clarity to some people if you ask, well, why are you doing this particular series of messages? So let me start off by saying, when we talk about a sign is something selected and appointed to represent some other thing. Just like letters of our alphabet are designed to, they are signs for the sound, all right? Or if you think about it, look at sheet music, right? Those are signs to tell us what the note is. They're not actually giving us, they're just symbols or signs, okay? So, for example, when the prophet told Hezekiah, on the going back of the shadow on the dial should be a sign, the sign signaling that he would recover from his illness, that he would serve and have another 15 years, see Jerusalem delivered from her assailants. The problem here is that there was nothing in nature to express what this sign, as the prophet's telling Hezekiah, there was nothing to correlate because there had not been a record of, say, God's signs translated into what they actually mean. We have the same problem with Isaiah when he was walking around barefoot. It had a connection with the Syrian conquest and, of course, majestic Egypt, and yet it was a sign of what was yet to unfold. So a lot of times when we read of signs in the Bible, we have nothing to compare it to because they are of God. They're not, like I said, a letter or a symbol. They're a little bit challenging for people. So when God was creating, he said of the celestial splendor of the stars, he said, let them be for signs. And if you, in your own time, some of you who followed me in learning Hebrew, look that up and translate it. It gives you some wild impact that our language, the English language, is a little bit dull in expressing and using some words that just sound very humdrum. But we can clearly interpret the meaning of let them be for signs, that they would be used to signify something beyond their brilliance, beyond their natural use or appearance. So could this statement by God, let them be used for signs, be merely an idea for us humans to be led by the night stars to guide us, or is there much more than just that? And I would say to you, without even thinking twice, there's infinitely more. We know that the Egyptians held the stars to be symbolic of divine and sacred. And if we turn to the work of George Smith, he is the one that wrote the Chaldean account of the deluge. He says, quote, "It is evident from the opening of the inscription on the first tablet of the great Chaldean work on astrology and astronomy that the functions of the stars were according to the Babylonians to act not only as regulators of seasons of the year, but also used as signs. For in those ages it was generally believed that the heavenly bodies gave by their appearance and position signs of events which were coming to pass or to be on the earth." The Reverend Peter Roberts, in his letters to Mr. Volney, states that he had come to accept the truth about the fact that the stars refer to an ancient promise of the Messiah and his work in conquering the serpent and putting away evil in his sufferings and ultimately by his finished work. There's a lot on this subject, and it's not all, when we think of the study of the stars, a lot of times we get into horoscopes and we go down this pathway of predicting. That's not what we're talking about here, because there are set things in the sky. Cicero, in translating a work on of the constellations by Aratus, the writer Aratus, said these signs are measured out that in so many descriptions divine wisdom might appear. And I could keep the quotes coming. There are so many of them. But as we turn to the primary source of the Bible, and we read, as I've been referencing for the last few weeks here, of certain wise men that came from the east, we know that they not only followed the star, but it's not a stretch. Because of what I'm going to show you today, it is not a stretch that they could see things in the stars that gave them the exact timing even of when they should go to seek out this child who would be labeled as King of the Jews. So it's important when we are taking a biblical perspective. These men were so moved by their observations that they made this really rugged trek all this way. I mean, I don't know about you, but think about it. They make this long journey. It's perfect timing. And on top of everything, they bring gifts and pay tribute to do obeisance, homage, worship to this child. As I mentioned last week, even from Psalm 19, where it says, the heavens declare the glory of God, that's Psalm 19. I think the psalmist was saying, these celestial bodies reveal God's handiwork, his power, his wisdom. And I know it's been used for books, but the theme is quite evident. The gospel is written in the stars. Now, let me just pause right here and say, if I'm looking to try and prove the existence that Jesus lived, we must first deal with his birth. You know, you can't talk about somebody who you say didn't live if you're not going to discuss being born. So that's an important part of what we're going to see in the stars, which gives us great information. But let me take a step back, and what I'm going to do sounds rather simplistic, and it's for a purpose, so just bear with me. When we view the gospel, we are introduced, for example, to the serpent in Genesis, and the record that follows after the three first chapters of Genesis, this unfolding drama of redemption that in Genesis 3:15 we are told requires a redeemer. You know, it's written in such a way in our English tongue that you might not be able to see it like that, but they call Genesis 3:15 the proto-evangelion, the gospel before the gospel, in Genesis 3:15. So it's important to note all of this. There's so many other things here. One, for example, that a child would be born in a particular place at a particular time. And then you have, we'll call it this vignette in the garden. The deception of the serpent, which required action by God to save the first family, if you want to say it like that. His first act, by the way, is expelling them out of the garden. Slaying an animal, that's the first slaying or shedding of blood, if you will, to cover, which will go through the Bible, talking about something must die for something else to live. So it becomes clear that what God was doing in the garden, there was communion, there was fellowship, there was perfect harmony until there wasn't. And the rest of the book is God's unfolding plan of how to reconcile us back, which took so long for a myriad number of reasons, and I don't want to start explaining them here. It's too long. But the reason why I am going down this pathway is, if you think about it, this is a very intricate tale to tell. A serpent in the garden, usurping God's word, leading the first Adam and Eve astray. It's a pretty wild tale to weave over hundreds, if not thousands of years, to let us know we need a redeemer, we need a savior. Pretty wild that you would spin the tale that something needs to die in order for something to live. And if you think about it, even from the Old Testament, where God in the book of Leviticus is giving orders, this is the prescribed method, you must slay a bull, you must, it's all killing of animals, revealing that there was something that God needed to intervene. Otherwise, had God not sent his only begotten Son, we would have stayed in the state fallen forever, and that means ever. And we die and we remain fallen. There's no redemption, there's no reconnection with God, there's no restored fellowship. Pretty dismal. So I want to pursue the subject of the gospel in the stars, not to deviate from what we do here, but to give real clarity, because I think when you start seeing what I see, and some of you have been exposed to this teaching, some of you not, but I think when you start to see it, it's kind of mind-boggling, and not just in one way, but in several ways, which I hope to show you today. All right, so what I find most interesting here is that we have some stars that move through the sky, others are stationary, some seem to belong to clusters or groups, some stand alone, some are brighter than others. Some have very distinct characteristics so that when you look up, you can say, oh, well, that's the belt right there, or there are kind of very identifiable stars in the sky that you come to know. If you don't know, you can get a little chart and look them up. So it's important to understand in antiquity, the stars were named, arranged, and organized into groups. And this becomes part of a mind-boggling thing, my first mind-boggling thing. The names of these stars, in fact, the name, if you look this up, you're going to find a lot of planets and constellations are named in the book of Job. You've got a mention of Pleiades, Orion, the Bear. You've got too many things in there. And Job is supposedly, and I can't tell you because I stay on the fence about this, whether Job is the oldest book or not. I'm not going to weigh in on that either. But the fact that I don't care how far you put him back in the writing, that these, as I said, Pleiades, Orion, they're identified in his writings, tells you we didn't make up these names. Some scientist, looking through a telescope didn't say yesterday, oh, I think we shall call this one. Didn't happen that way. So very important to understand how old the name of some of these are, number one. And as I said last week, we get our word from zodiac, from the Greek word zoad, directions, steps. So the moon makes 12 complete revolutions around the earth, or 12 complete steps, or zoads, all right? 12 parts of 30 degrees each. 12 times 30 degrees completes the circle. There is then 12 steps or stages to the sun's path. In this way, the 12 months or 12 moons are called the zodiac. So let me reference the 12 signs, and I will tell you their meaning. Most of you know certain ones because you were born in a certain month, and even if you're not into this, I'm this or I'm that, right? So, yeah. Okay, Virgo, the Virgin, a figure of a young woman prostrate with an ear of wheat in one hand and a branch in the other. Libra, the scales, a pair of balances with one end of the beam up and the other weight or beam down, revealing the act of weigh or measurement. Scorpio, from the scorpion, the figure of a dangerous insect with its tail posed to strike. Sagittarius, the bowman, a figure of a horse with a body, arms, head of a man, a centaur with a bow drawn and arrow pointed at the scorpion. Now, you might say, oh, she's reading us horoscope stuff. What the heck's going on? Just be patient. Capricorn, or Capricornus, the goat, the figure of this goat in a death spiral with the hinder parts of its body culminating in the tail of a fish. Aquarius, the true waterman, the image of a man with a large urn as he appears to be dumping or pouring it out into a body of water, maybe the stream, river. Pisces, the two fishes in the act of swimming, one towards the north and one towards the elliptic. Aries, the ram, by some refer to this as a lamb, the figure of a strong sheep with a very powerful horns looking over a field. Taurus, the bull, this figure is pure power in every part of this depiction, capturing great force and energy. Gemini, the twins. And, I'm just as bad as maybe some of you because I always thought it was two of the same gender. But what do you know, right? The twins are sometimes referred to in antiquity as Adam and Eve. In older representations, these are two goats or kids. Cancer, the crab. This image or act of the crab holding onto something with its pincer claws. Leo, the lion, the figure of power, majesty, lunging forth to rend with his feet the scaly serpent of Hydra. Here, the serpent is seen fleeing. These 12 signs cover a large part of the visible sky. We call this the solar zodiac. Now, we have a further elaboration in the lunar zodiac. The moon makes its revolution around the earth approximately 28 days. Don't quote me scientifically on any of this. I'm not a scientist, an astrologer, or an astronomer, so chill out, okay? Had to say that. So we have 28 sections or divisions, each marking out a zodiac or a step for each day. Let's add this to the 12 signs that do not stand alone. They're conjoined with other signs or symbols to the north and south. So we have 3 constellations that are called decans, and this word decan symbolizing, again, a step, a part or a piece. So very much like Zoad, same concept. So most people, when they are touching this subject in the modern frame of reference, they will say, oh, well, you must be very interested in the work of Galileo or Copernicus, because they were in their time. In fact, Galileo is considered the father of modern astronomy because for the first time he looked through a refracted lens at what was in the sky. But let me just tell you something. If you think that he's the father of it all, you have it very wrong. The studies of astronomical observations date back, that we have chronicled, that we can reference, date back to about 1600 BC. There are some earlier records from other cultures, but they are not even legible. So I'm a linguist, but I'm not crazy. Let's call it 1600, all right? The Northern Europe find of the Nebra disk, which kind of is the first, we'll call it, reference to what's in the sky. But beyond that, we have the first documented record of astronomical observations from the Assyrio-Babylonians, as well as the Suraya Siddhanta, a Sanskrit treaty dated to the 4th century BC, 14 chapters of writing that really lay it out. Now, here's where I started to get really excited. And you have to indulge me for a second, because sometimes when I find things, I'm like, yeah, this is amazing, right? I may be the only one reacting like that, okay? But you have to kind of understand what I'm about to say was so exciting for me, because I, much like many of you that have been here a long time, I studied a lot of this, but there's a lot of things that were not filled in for me. So I had to kind of go back and do some more digging. Sometime in the 800s AD, you have a man, an astrologer by the name of Abu Mashar, an Arab, and he came to Baghdad as an expert on the hadith. So his analysis of sections of the Quran, let's say, or writings that pertain to the Quran. He had a major falling out with the religious people of his day, and I'm giving you the very simple story. He may very well be the father of astronomy as we know it. And the reason why I say that is first of all, if you want to study his works, you must read Arabic. All right. Anybody here read Arabic? Knock yourself out. But you don't have to do that. I will give you the quick notes for this. So here's the thing. We believe with pretty good certainty that he drew from Greek, Indian, Sasanian, Syrian, and pre-Islamic Arabic knowledge. He expounded on the astrological theory of the Hurrians in the Kitab al-Madkar al-Kabir, the Great Introduction, it's a writing, the Great Introduction to the Stars, which became the basic handbook for not just Islam, but for Byzantium and Western Europe as well. So basically, his writings spread, and they became what we'd call the gold standard. Why is this important? Why does this matter? Well, first of all, if you can find his work and can translate it or read it, the beautiful thing is you can see what I saw, and my eyes went, whoa, whoa. You're going to say, tell me already, tell me. I'm getting there. Just be patient. So about 300 years after this man dies, Abu Mashar, another man, a Jewish Orientalist by the name of Ibn Isra, who lived in Zaragoza, Spain. He's a learned astronomer, but he wrote a commentary on Abu Mashar's work 300 years earlier, right? He wrote this commentary. This is what the Jewish scholars said with regards to Abu Mashar's work. According to Abu Mashar, none of these forms from their first invention have varied in coming down to us, nor one of their words or names, not anything has changed, been added, or removed. It is from these ancient studies that we can examine, and he goes on to basically say nothing has changed in the sky in the 300 years since Abu Mashar to his analysis. But even more, he goes back, the Jewish scholar goes back behind Abu Mashar to basically say this is where he pulled all of the information from, basically making it much older than Abu Mashar's writing. Now, let me tell you what's so novel about this and what made me go, you have a man who is a religious, devout follower of Islam, of Muhammad, and you have a Jew say, devout follower of Moses, if you want to put it that way. And they both agree, this is the miracle, that they both agree. No, that's not the miracle. They both agree on the terminology and how we should view what's in the sky. And this is way before Christ, after Christ. But the novelty of this is seeing that they're referencing materials that come earlier, saying nothing has changed. So when we begin trying to make sense of what's in the sky, I want you to think that the names and the order of things are very old and very ancient. Of course, God, if you believe the creation, God put them there for a sign. So why it becomes mind-boggling is there are definitions that in the verbiage, for example, I'll get to this, I'm probably stepping ahead of myself, but in the verbiage of describing Virgo, the Virgin, there's language there and concepts that if you're only looking at Virgo, the Virgin, you must also look at what are called the decans that are to the north and the south. And they tell a more elaborate story than just seeing the Virgin prostrate on the ground with wheat and branch in hand. They tell a much bigger story. In fact, you begin to see why in antiquity you've got all of these stories of mother and child. Every culture has them. You're familiar with this, right? We can go from early on, the Semiramis. You can look to every culture. Isis in the Egyptian realm. Every culture has a mother and child sequence. But here's the problem. If you were trying to make it fit the Egyptian mother and child, you'd be hard-pressed, because once you get in to see what's to the north and the south of Virgo the Virgin, you realize that it basically negates most of the people or personages that people want to say, oh, that's describing mother and child of this culture. It can't be, based on the surrounding patterns that actually tell you more and let you kind of step away and say this can only be talking about one person. Let me pause for a second. All right, so think of these, what I call decans. Decans are supporting actors. They are supporting roles to the main, so Virgo, and then the supporting roles that give us a better picture. If we should further investigate, there is good reason to believe that what comes down in all of these writings is actually antediluvian, pre-flood concepts. And I say that because in the ancient Chaldean and Persian and even in the Chinese records, we find a lot of evidence for this, all right? As well, we find strange things like the days of the week, our days of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. They are all actually in antiquity referring to something up in the sky. Sun day, Monday, moon day, right? Twisco day, which is Anglo-Saxon for the word Mars. Woden's day, Woden Mercury for Wednesday. Thor's day, Thor is the same as Jupiter. Freya day, Freya is the same as Venus. And Saturn day as Saturday. What on earth do you do with all this, right? Because it's a lot of information. Is it relevant, or are we just looking at oddities? It's relevant. Just bear with me. We can glean even the letters of our alphabet are connected to the stars. How is that possible? I don't know. But without getting overly bogged down, we have good reason to believe that the alphabet goes back a lot further than what we have hypothesized. So there's good evidence for it to be much older. And you might say, well, what about, you're going back that far, you're going back to linear A, linear B, not that far, but we're going back to probably much earlier than folks have dated certain writings. So let's just leave that one there. Okay, so let's kind of start tackling this. The book of Isaiah says, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. That's Isaiah 7:14. Our faith proclaims, and what we believe from the Bible, from the New Testament, that Mary was still a virgin in the verbiage of her not knowing Joseph. Depart from me, I knew you not. No, that wasn't what she was meaning. She didn't know Joseph in the biblical way, all right? Like, you know what I'm talking about, when she conceived Jesus, okay. So it's captivating. As I said, the first sign that we should look into is Virgo, representing the Virgin. So if you start looking in Arabic, that same word for virgin, Adara, in the Greek language, she would be Parthenos, Astrea or Athena. She is Bethula in the Syriac tradition. And why is this interesting? Because in every tradition, regardless of what they call her, she is a pure virgin. There is also, if you're going to look this up, and I always encourage you to do so, you've got, as I said, many cultures. Krishna is one of them, said to be born of a virgin. All of the different entities, all of what I've already named, Egyptians, Chinese, everybody had the mother and child kind of in their culture. So the Greeks, though, it's kind of interesting. The Greeks were completely steeped in the stories of gods being born out of things like Aphrodite being born from the foam of the sea. Oh, hey, it's a good day. Was that foam or was that something else? I don't know. So stating a child was born of a virgin within Greek antiquity wouldn't be so radical, right? It's no big deal. I mean, if you can be born out of foam, you can come out of a virgin, right? Please don't do anything with that, okay? Please. They've got things like Mithras, right? Or the Phrygian Roman god Attis, born of a virgin on December 25th. So, well, what all does this have to do with the life of Christ? Well, okay, Virgo, the virgin, is seen holding in her hand, as I said, an ear of wheat. And pay attention to this, because the scripture tells us he who would bruise the serpent's head was to be of the seed of a woman. So the first zodiac sign reveals a detail that cannot specifically be attached to another virgin in mythology or in antiquity. Why? Well, she's a virgin, and I named you many, but she holds and produces forth seed, Christ, who will make the reference to himself in the Bible. He says, as a grain of wheat or corn needing to go into the earth, basically die and go into the earth, and so he was referencing himself. He must die, that life may come out of his death. So, and that passage, by the way, John 12, where they want to see Jesus, right? And it is Jesus himself that says, as the corn or seed which needs to fall into the ground in order to ensure its fruitfulness. So the prophets refer to the one who is to come as a branch. You can probably off the top of your head think of so many places in the Old Testament where the branch, the bow, the plant, the rod of the stem of the root of Jesse, the branch of his roots, the righteous branch, the branch of the Lord, the servant, God's servant, the branch. There's so many of them. Just look them up. So this sign holds forth the virgin seed as the branch. Now, you might say to me, okay, and she's laying prostrate with these items in her hands. Could this represent somebody else? Well, possibly if you didn't have what's to the north and to the south of her. So remember I said that there are concepts in these decans, right? 3 components. So for Virgo, here we go. So for Virgo, we have, whether you want to call it comma or coma, Centaurus, and my favorite one here, boots. Or booty, I don't know. Plural. You heard it in church, okay? So, according to, this is what is the mind-boggling part. According to Abu Mashar, who was not a Christian, and remember, he's writing sometime in the 800s AD. He says, there arises in the first decan, as the Persian, Chaldean, and Egyptians teach, a young woman whose Persian name denotes pure virgin sitting on a throne, nourishing an infant boy. This boy had a Hebrew name, known by some as Yesu, Isaiah, which is how the Greeks referred to Jesus. And this is a Muslim writing this in 800 AD, saying that there is a name to the child in the zodiac. I sat kind of looking at that, and I going like this to close my jaw, Because you'd expect a Christian to write this. You'd expect anybody but a Muslim to write this because the Muslims say, yes, he's a prophet, but that's all. He lived, but that's all. So mind-boggling that he wrote this and goes on to describe things that, again, if you're looking, you're going to say, well, how come I never saw this? Well, I don't know. We're looking at it right now. So Centaurus, I'm jumping over the comma, but Centaurus is the second decan of Virgo and denotes a double nature. So you can kind of look and say, you see the word centaur right here, right? That in mythology, half man, half beast. But in the use of how this was parsed in the sky, they were saying duality in one person. Who do you know that could fit that? A duality in one person? Because all these other people that tried to say born of a virgin, they didn't have a duality to them. Jesus was all man and all God at the same time. So this Centaurus was even interpreted by non-Christians to represent the duality of what would become the child that is being nurtured, would become. So very interesting. It's kind of actually like, how did we not see that before, right? Then there's something more to this. So the name of this deacon in Arabic and Hebrew means the despised one. I don't know. Do you think that that represents any of the people that I mentioned in antiquity? No. The brightest star in what the Greeks called the Chiron, a word was most likely a Hebrew loanword signifying the pierced one. That's very interesting because I don't know, when you start hearing everything that's up there that has been, and I didn't make this up, this is thousands of years old, you kind of start going, wow, well, how did they get to that? I mean, how did they know? Well, obviously, people's eyes had to have been opened by God, whether they believed or not, to be able to interpret this. And by the way, whether it was a Muslim, a Jew, or a Christian looking into the sky, there's not one capacity to begin altering what's there. It's whatever is there is there. You cannot alter it. So I want you to think about a lot of these words. The despised one, the pierced one. This is the last one here. Boots, a word or name that comes from the Greek, signifying the shepherd or guardian of the flock, and it appears to have its roots in Hebrew, maybe a loan or borrow word from bo or vo, meaning the coming one or the one that was to come. So what do you do with this? The despised one, the pierced one, the one that was to come, and they're all sitting, their placement is around the Virgin. Now, if you're like me, you are going to look at this and you're going to go, very interesting. Okay, what do we do with this? But when you start to see the rest of it unfold, you realize something. Many cultures have very similar themes. Take, for example, in antiquity, the flood narratives, the flood passages. We've got different accounts. That tells me that there is a common thread or a common stream. In other words, we always say there's a kernel of truth in something, right? So when you see all of these different cultures, some of them writing further back, others writing a little later, but they're all telling a story, for example, of the great flood that flooded the earth, and much of the creation was wiped away or killed. You have to ask yourself, is that simply great storytelling that was transferred over from different cultures, or did they all have a common thread and there's a kernel of truth in all of this? The same concept must be applied to looking into the sky, because when you see how the story that unfolds there, you're going to see the gospel in the stars. You're going to see, and I will explain if I can to the best of my ability, how if you're just looking for proof, and you say to me, well, okay, we are going to probe and mine the Bible, but if you're looking for proof and we read that God set the stars in the sky for a sign, I'm not sure what you do with all this information when you start to see, and I haven't even scratched the surface. When you start to see what is painted there, the depiction, you start to kind of think, wait a minute, okay. So for all those people that say Jesus is relatively, forgive me, I try not to laugh when I say this, but Jesus is relatively new in the concept or minds of people because they believe that Jesus came to be only from the New Testament. This is why I said you can't read just the New Testament. You need both Old and New because we know Jesus was there. You will not read it in English, in any of your books in English, but you will read in the Hebrew Bible when it says in the beginning, Bereshit bara Elohim. As I said, and I've referenced this before, Elohim is the majestic plural. And unless you are part of today's culture where you want to be identified as they, them, I only know of one capacity to address someone as a plurality, and that is God in his triune, God the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And if you're reading it, it says that the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the earth. We don't have any problem reading John that in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos is Christ. So when you think about it, when God spoke the word, he spoke the Logos wasn't created. The Logos was facing God. And if you want to put it in a different perspective, you can't separate these. He was there in the beginning. This is why he turns to those Pharisees and says, before Abraham was, I am. Saying, I was here way before, at the beginning. So it's imperative that we handle this type of study without going, I say, off the deep end, because I'm not looking to prognosticate your future like a horoscope. Today you're going to have a really miserable day. No. Or great things are going to happen to you today. And it's like, okay, what? What? That's your horoscope. It's like a little Chinese fortune cookie, right? Like, okay, everybody got one of these. So what, right? Okay. But what this does is it lets us take a different look. So we have maps, for example, of countries. You want to know what America looks like? You look at a map. You want to know what California looks like? You go to San Francisco. No. You want to see what California looks like? You get a map, right? And you look at the map, and you can look at everything that's there. Well, that's what, when we look in the sky, there are maps of the sky. And I'm hoping maybe in the next week or two I can find a source that I can use to show you what that map of the sky looks like, because it will put flesh and blood on everything that I'm saying. Otherwise, I'm just talking about things, and you say, oh, okay, Virgo the Virgin in the sky. But when you see how each of what is to the north and the south of each of these 12 zodiac signs, you begin to realize that two things. One, see, the devil knows how to take what God made and twist it, right? So this becomes very clear to me. You know, we avoid certain things because we know it's associated with other things that we kind of frown upon. But this was given by God. So the real reality is, just like everything else, the devil manages to corrupt and usurp so that we wouldn't even look because, oh, that's part of a, cultic horoscope and all that. No, we need to look because it's not part of that. That's what the devil did, all right? But what we're looking at is something that is of God. And I want to make that clear because there's going to be people that say, oh, she's teaching out of the zodiac? What the heck? Pastor Scott's such a solid Bible teacher. How did she end up here? You'll see. It's not that I'm teaching you the zodiac. I'm going to show you a different way of seeing the gospel in the stars, and that's kind of put a period there. So what I'm hoping to accomplish in this, and I told you it's pretty long, but I also, from this study of the sky, will lead me to show you how these people could look in the sky and know at a specific time that this child was going to be born. This is what's so mind-boggling to me. Like, if I looked at a map of the sky right now, I'd have no way. I'd be like, oh, it's nice pictures, but I don't know what that is. They could look, and with precision, they could know what time the child was going to be born. They knew how long it would take them to journey, and I'm pretty sure about this. Maybe they were off in their calculations a little bit because I think they were coming to worship the baby, but when they got there, he was no longer a baby, all right? So whether that was the journey was long or they miscalculated, I don't know. But the point I'm saying is that when we read the gospel message. And then you can step back and say, yes, and what confirms it? Long before this book was ever written, long before not just the canonization, but long before this book existed, there was the gospel in the stars. And that was God's way of revealing. So when you say, well, how did they know? How could they have figured this out? When you see it all laid out, the other thing that, not just to see stars and planets and everything that's aligned, but I referenced the star that they did indeed follow, which interestingly enough, as I mentioned, no one else really took note of except them. So you could say this was God leading them, but however you want to get to this point, what I'm telling you is when the next time somebody says to you, yeah, but there's no proof, I'm not asking you to use this type of series to prove or to validate, because I've got other things that are probably even more substantial to bring to you, to show you, so that the next time somebody asks, see, let me give you some examples. We need to look at, this. That's why I said it's a big subject. We need to look at the census that occurred for Joseph and Mary, to understand which date, when, and where, and if we can find it historically, that's very important. We also need to look at the Roman records, because so many people said they've combed the records, but they've overlooked 2 or 3 things that actually go like that, okay? So there's that. And then there are things that you just, if you're going to say, I just don't know that Jesus lived now, you're telling me all this and I just can't be sure because I just want to be a pain. I'm going to show you people that were around Jesus. And we're going to take a deep dive. We're going to look at individuals like Caiaphas. And the reason for looking at Caiaphas, a lot of people say, oh, it's all made up. Well, we know that Caiaphas' ossuary was found many years back. And it's that Caiaphas. We know definitively the bones date back to a certain period, so we can, with pretty high certainty, say these are the bones of Caiaphas, the same Caiaphas that was, even though that's a common name, same Caiaphas of the Bible. And then we have to look at other things. Again, if we're going to make up a person and the person never existed, you wouldn't have a trial. You wouldn't have actually multiple trials. Do you try somebody who doesn't exist? I don't know. Well, never mind. My point is there are too many personages, historical personages, around the person of Christ. And while many of our brothers and sisters who are of the Jewish faith refuse to acknowledge that Jesus lived, that he performed miracles, and I could keep going on, instead, they would just completely, in this modern age, say, no, that's blasphemy. But the reality is, in Jesus' day, the Jewish people, and we have a chronicle of this, were worried, so much so that they were the ones at their behest to get guards put in front of the tomb where they placed Jesus' body. Do you do that for someone who doesn't exist? There's just too much there. So the next question, you might say, well, okay, well, you're going to prove that he lived, but was he all man and all God? Well, here's the thing. If you're going to engage in that line of reasoning or that line of questioning, we really do have a problem, because it shows me that you're not reading this book, because I have yet to find any individual in my lifetime or in history that has raised a child from the dead, that has made someone who lacked eyesight to see, who made people who were crippled. Well, I've yet to see that. I've seen a lot of charlatans in the church profess to be healers, but I've not seen that. And I only see it in this book. And it's the same person that was put on trial by both the Jews and the Romans. So again, you almost have to see that everything is daisy-chained. And you could say, well, what happens if you find information that could validate the other way? Sorry to break it to you, because I know people say, oh, you're really sure of yourself, but I've been at this for a long time. And when I say a long time, maybe my 30 years of studying the Bible is not a lot to some of you, but when you spend as many hours in the day combing the scriptures, come back and talk to me when you get to the same point of saying there's way too much information in here, And you can't play this game of, well, how do we trust that the gospel records are true? How can we trust records that were written so far after the life and death of Christ? Hold that thought for just a minute. And let me reference something delicious. At the opening of the message, I referenced a gentleman who wanted to quote stuff that the late Dr. Scott had said. Now, did he play it back on a tape, or is it seared in his mind? Whatever it is, doesn't matter to me. He remembered it. And that's probably something, look, I've been here for 20 years. That's probably something that was said 30 or 40 years ago. I don't know if it's verbatim, but I can definitely see that that would have been something that the late Dr. Scott would have said. So, hear me out. You've got these men who were around Jesus, and if they wrote within a 20 to 40 year span, except for John, a 20 to 40 year span, that's the earliest and maybe the latest date. Why is it so mind-boggling? But, oh, it's too far. But I just told you, a man just quoted something that the late Dr. Scott said, and you had no problem believing that. Well, how do you know that that was what said? Well, when you've got several different witnesses, it's like when a crime is committed and there are multiple witnesses and they're interviewed. How did the crime happen? What did you see? What happened? And this person says his version. This person tells his version. These are the disciples, not a crime scene, but they are telling what they saw. And they all wrote in different places. So you make it make sense to me, because they didn't do it verbatim. That's the other thing. I mean, if you're trying to make a ruse, you're going to make sure, use these words, say it this way, write it this way, so our stories are exactly lined up. No, the way the evidence presents itself is 100% credible. There are some hard to understand things in there maybe, but 100% credible based on the fact they were writing in different places at different times, and we know that they disbanded quickly. So it's not as though they said, okay, well, I'm going to go my way, and when I get over there, I'm going to write, and I'm going to sit down, and I'll write a letter that has 16 chapters to it, and you're going to sit down and write a letter that has 21 chapters to it, and you're going to say this, and I'm going to say that. If that happened that way, tap me out right now, because it didn't. And that's why when people say, well, I read the Gospels and they don't all line up. Exactly. That's what when we call the veracity of the witnesses, it's not that they were parroting back. In fact, if you look carefully, one will be speaking from a certain perspective. One will be speaking through a different lens. For example, I've said this before, John was telling the story through the eyes of someone who actually believed that Jesus was back there in eternity and that he is eternal, that he ever liveth, and that he's coming back again. So when you start to put all this together and you combine it with what's in the sky, you're going to end up with something that says, okay, now, and then you've got supporting evidence, as I said. We're going to look into the Romans. We're going to look into the Jews. We're going to look into censuses. We're going to look into all of these that will build up, and you'll either walk away saying, wow, we just spent a lot of time examining a lot of evidence, which I don't know what it means, or you're going to walk away saying, wow, my faith is even more strong, because this is not just take my word. I want to show you. I actually want to show you the splendor of this. And when you see it for yourself, I think it brings just a whole different way of looking at it, that special word, concretionizing one's faith, and which it does. I truly believe that. There is, as I said, so much on this subject, so I'm hoping that you will come along for the ride. And for those folks out there, I need to reiterate this before I go. For the folks out there who don't listen properly to what I said, please do not make the mistake of condemning what I'm saying or how I'm saying it, thinking that I'm dabbling in something, because I just explained to you that that which is commonplace in today's world, the divination of your day based on your birth date and your astrological sign, to me, that's a little bit like, I don't go there, but this is different. And this has to do with everything that God said before it was ever written in a book. I don't know about you, but if somebody said to me, here, this is what was written at the creation, and God, who has all this knowledge, knew the need, even in creation, to provide a redeemer. As I said, wait until we get into looking at all of these with their supporting actors, the supporting north and south deacons, and you'll see that there's a little bit more meat on this than just depicting a virgin or depicting a man who is half this and half that, because the supporting actors may have actions towards other actors in the complete zodiac that paint a picture. I'll just say this to you. We'll be looking at Scorpio or Scorpion, and you'll see in the setup you've got what most would interpret as Christ destroying the serpent, but you have to see it in the whole picture to understand first Scorpio itself and then the supporting actors around it. Paints the picture for us to see that the book of Revelation has it right, that there will be an end to this serpent, father of lies. But that end comes not because we do something, but because Christ is shown both in the book of Revelation and in the stars as Christ the Conqueror, King of Kings, Lord of Lords. Please, I hope you'll stay along for this journey, because I think this is kind of one of those, if you've never heard some of this stuff before, it is life-changing. I hope you'll be here next week. That's my message. Thank you. You may be seated. If you brought an offering today and you don't know where you should put it, the ushers will point you in the direction. We've got plenty of places. And I'm really kind of hoping to bring you some images soon, because this does actually put all the color and all the perspective on what I'm discussing. It's hard to imagine if you haven't seen some of these. So I hope to show you that either next week or at least in the coming weeks. In the meantime, I hope you all stay safe and have a wonderful weekend. I will see you soon. Be looking at you. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.